Who are the Ashkenazi, Sephardic, and Mizrahi Jews? Why do they have different cultures, languages, and traditions, yet share the same deep roots? Their history is full of exile, survival, and adaptation across different lands. From the ancient Middle East to Europe and North Africa, their journey has shaped Jewish identity in surprising ways. But the real mystery lies deeper. To understand the full story and uncover the unexpected connections, watch the video till the end. Imagine standing in the heart of ancient Jerusalem, where the grand Temple of Solomon once stood, a beacon of faith, wisdom, and divine connection. The air is thick with the scent of burning incense, the sounds of prayers rising like a chorus, a city alive with devotion. This was the birthplace of a people whose story would soon take an unimaginable turn, one of exile, longing, and resilience. The year is 586 BCE. The mighty Babylonian Empire, led by King Nebuchadnezzar II, storms the gates of Jerusalem. The temple, the sacred heart of Jewish life, is reduced to ashes. Families are torn apart, streets run with fear, and the city, once vibrant and full of life, is left in ruins. Thousands of Jews are taken captive, forced to march across the scorching desert toward Babylon, a land foreign and unfamiliar. Imagine their pain. Their home, gone. Their temple, destroyed. Their future, uncertain. Yet, amidst despair, something remarkable happens. They do not forget who they are. In the heart of exile, they cling to their faith, their customs, and their identity. They sing psalms by the rivers of Babylon, mourning the loss of Jerusalem, but vowing never to let it fade from their hearts. It is here, in Babylon, that the Jewish people begin something extraordinary. They adapt, they survive, and they strengthen. They build communities, study sacred texts, and plant the seeds of resilience that will sustain them through the centuries. But this is only the beginning. Fast forward to 70 CE. Another empire, more powerful than Babylon, now rules the land, the Romans. Tension has been rising for years, and finally, a great revolt breaks out. But the Roman legions are merciless. Under the command of Titus, the Second Temple, one of the greatest symbols of Jewish faith, is burned to the ground. The city is crushed. And this time, the exile is even greater. Hundreds of thousands of Jews are killed, enslaved, or forced to flee. Some are taken to Rome, paraded through the streets as trophies of war. Others scatter to the farthest corners of the world, North Africa, Persia, Yemen, Spain, and beyond. This is the moment the Jewish people become a truly global nation without a land. But instead of disappearing, they carry their traditions with them. In each new place, they rebuild. They create schools, businesses, and synagogues. They write, debate, and preserve their heritage, no matter how harsh the world around them becomes. The destruction of Jerusalem should have been the end. But instead, it became the beginning of something far greater. It forged a people who could bend but never break. Their longing for home would never fade. But neither would their ability to adapt, survive, and thrive. And so, the Jewish diaspora began. A story of exile, struggle, and an unbreakable bond to the land they once called home. The Jewish people had already endured centuries of exile, carrying the scars of Babylonian captivity and Roman destruction. Yet, in the face of loss, they proved something extraordinary. They were unbreakable. From the ashes of Jerusalem, they spread across the world, planting roots in lands both welcoming and hostile. Among these lands, one stood out as a beacon of hope, a place where Jewish culture would not only survive but flourish. Iberia, the land of Spain and Portugal. When the first Jewish families arrived in Spain and Portugal, the Roman Empire still ruled. Though life was not without hardship, Jewish communities managed to carve a space for themselves, growing in numbers and influence. But it was not until the arrival of Islam in the 8th century that the Jewish people saw a true transformation. With the Islamic conquest of Spain, known as Al-Andalus, a new era began. One of prosperity, learning, and cultural brilliance. Under Muslim rule, Jews were allowed to practice their faith freely, trade openly, and most importantly, contribute to the intellectual and artistic explosion of the time. This was the golden age of Jewish culture in Spain, 10th to 12th centuries, a period when Jewish poets, scientists, philosophers, and traders rose to prominence. Cities like Córdoba and Granada became centers of Jewish scholarship, where minds like Maimonides, one of the greatest Jewish philosophers, reshaped Jewish thought forever. For the first time in centuries, the Jewish people were not just surviving, they were thriving. But golden ages are fragile. The same land that had welcomed the Jewish people would soon turn against them. As Christian kingdoms in the north of Spain began pushing southward, reclaiming land from Muslim rule, the Jews found themselves caught in the middle. At first, things remained stable, but with each Christian victory, Jewish life became harder. Restrictions grew, opportunities shrank, and anti-Jewish sentiment spread like wildfire. By the late 14th century, hatred erupted into violence. Jewish quarters were burned. Families were forced to convert to Christianity or flee, and thousands were murdered in brutal pogroms. And then, the final blow came. 1492, the year of exile. In 1492, King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella issued the Alhambra Decree, a command that would seal the fate of Spanish Jews forever. The decree was simple yet cruel. Convert to Christianity or leave Spain. Imagine the heartbreak. The Jewish people had called Spain home for over 1,000 years. Generations had been born there, lived there, and flourished there. And now, in an instant, they were cast out, forced to abandon everything. Caravans of Jewish families fled across the sea, some to North Africa, some to the Ottoman Empire, some to the Netherlands. Many perished along the way. Others arrived in new lands, strangers once again, forced to rebuild from nothing, and thus the Sephardic Jews were born, not as citizens of Spain, but as wanderers, carrying the memory of their golden age and the pain of their exile wherever they went. The pain of exile was nothing new to the Jewish people. They had been forced from their homeland, pushed out of Babylon, and expelled from Spain. Yet, each time they fell, they rose again, carrying their traditions, their faith, and their resilience to new lands. As the Sephardic Jews scattered across the Ottoman Empire, North Africa, and beyond, another group of Jews was carving out a different fate, one of survival in the harsh, unforgiving lands of Central and Eastern Europe. In the 9th and 10th centuries, Jewish families arrived in the Rhineland, modern-day Germany and France, seeking safety and stability. They came as traders, scholars, and craftsmen, hoping to rebuild after centuries of wandering. But Europe was different. Unlike the warmth of Spain, where Sephardic Jews had once thrived, these lands were colder, both in climate and in acceptance. At first, they found protection under certain kings and noblemen who saw their skills as valuable. They built synagogues, studied Torah, and established vibrant Jewish communities in towns along the Rhine River, Mainz, Worms, and Speyer. But safety was always fragile, and history would soon remind them that peace never lasted long. In 1096, the call for the First Crusade rang across Europe. Armies of Christian warriors gathered to reclaim the Holy Land. But before they even reached Jerusalem, they turned their rage toward an easier target: the Jewish communities of the Rhineland. Mobs stormed into Jewish quarters, setting fire to homes, dragging families into the streets, and forcing them to choose: convert to Christianity or die. Some took their own lives rather than abandon their faith. Others hid, ran, or watched as their loved ones were slaughtered. This was not an isolated event. Pogroms, violent attacks against Jews, became a brutal reality. Each time a crisis hit Europe, whether it was famine, plague, or political turmoil, the Jewish people became the scapegoats. Yet, Despite the bloodshed, they endured. They clung to their faith, their traditions, and their identity, refusing to be erased. By the 13th and 14th centuries, many Jewish families fled westward, seeking shelter in Poland, Lithuania, and Russia. Unlike Western Europe, where Jews faced relentless persecution, Polish kings offered them protection and land to settle. Here, they found something they had not known for centuries: a chance to breathe, to build, to grow. And grow they did. Jewish communities flourished, becoming scholars, merchants, and educators. Over time, they developed Yiddish, a fusion of Hebrew, German, and Slavic languages, a language that became the heartbeat of Ashkenazi culture. But history never forgets the Jewish people. What seemed like a refuge would one day turn into yet another battle for survival. For now, though, the Ashkenazi Jews had found a place to call home. But how long would it last? For centuries, the Jewish people had been forced to adapt, rebuild, and survive in foreign lands. The Sephardic Jews had seen their golden age in Spain turn to ashes of exile. The Ashkenazi Jews had carved out a home in Central and Eastern Europe, only to face waves of brutal persecution. But while these groups wandered into new lands, one group of Jews never left the lands of their ancestors: the Mizrahi Jews. These were the Jews of the Middle East and North Africa. They had been in Babylon, Persia, Egypt, and Yemen long before the Romans destroyed Jerusalem. Their story is one of deep roots, ancient traditions, and quiet resilience. When the Babylonians conquered Jerusalem in 586 BCE, they took Jewish captives back to Babylon, modern-day Iraq. Unlike the Jews of Spain or Europe, these exiles never completely left the region. Instead, they built one of the most significant Jewish communities in history. For nearly 2,500 years, the Jews of Babylon flourished, writing the Babylonian Talmud, shaping Jewish law, and preserving traditions that would spread across the Jewish world. Meanwhile, in Persia, modern Iran, Egypt, and Yemen, Jewish communities thrived under different rulers. They became scholars, doctors, traders, and poets. But like all Jewish communities throughout history, they were never truly safe. Under Islamic rule, Mizrahi Jews were given a status called dhimmi, protected but second-class citizens. They were allowed to practice Judaism, but always with restrictions. Some Muslim rulers welcomed Jewish scholars into their courts, but others imposed heavy taxes, forced conversions, and humiliations. In Baghdad, during the Islamic Golden Age, Jewish intellectuals played a key role in translating and preserving Greek and Persian knowledge. In Morocco, Tunisia, and Yemen, Jewish merchants helped connect trade routes. But in the blink of an eye, everything could change. One ruler might protect them, but the next could burn synagogues and expel families overnight. Despite this, Mizrahi Jews held on to their traditions. Their Hebrew had an Arabic lilt, their prayers had melodies untouched by European influence, and their food carried the spices of the lands they lived in. For centuries, Mizrahi Jews had managed to survive in the Middle East and North Africa. But in the 20th century, their fate took a tragic turn. As Arab nationalism rose, and as tensions over Israel grew, Jews across these regions faced a new kind of danger. In Iraq, Egypt, Syria, and Yemen, centuries-old Jewish communities were suddenly seen as outsiders, enemies, and threats. Synagogues were burned. Jewish homes were seized. Families were forced to flee in the middle of the night. By the 1950s and 60s, nearly 850,000 Mizrahi Jews were expelled or fled from Arab lands. They left behind their homes, their businesses, their histories, erased overnight. And just like their Sephardic and Ashkenazi brothers before them, they became exiles once again. But exile had never broken them before, and it wouldn't break them now. The Mizrahi Jews carried their traditions, their music, their language, and their faith to Israel, to Europe, to America, determined that no matter where history pushed them, they would never disappear. And so, exile became the common thread binding all Jewish communities. The Sephardic Jews, once flourishing in Spain, were cast into foreign lands. The Ashkenazi Jews, struggling against persecution in Europe, found brief moments of peace before being uprooted again. The Mizrahi Jews, who had endured for centuries in the Middle East, saw their ancient communities vanish in the 20th century. Yet despite being scattered across the world, something incredible happened. They did not become strangers to one another. They carried their Jewish identity with them, adapting to the cultures around them while preserving what made them unique. And in these differences, language, traditions, and customs lay the heart of their resilience. Language is more than just words. It's history, struggle, and identity. The three Jewish communities, Sephardic, Ashkenazi, and Mizrahi, each developed a distinct language that reflected their journeys. The Sephardic Jews, scattered across the Ottoman Empire, North Africa, and Europe, spoke Ladino, a beautiful blend of Spanish, Hebrew, Arabic, and Turkish. It carried the soul of medieval Spain, a reminder of the home they had lost but never forgotten. The Ashkenazi Jews, living in Central and Eastern Europe, spoke Yiddish, a mix of Hebrew, German, and Slavic languages. It was the language of the shtetls, the bustling marketplaces, and the whispered prayers of a people who had learned to live between fear and faith. The Mizrahi Jews, whose roots traced back to Babylon, Persia, and the Arabian lands, spoke Judeo-Arabic, Judeo-Persian, and other local dialects. Their words carried the echoes of ancient times, woven into the fabric of Middle Eastern culture. And yet, when they came together, especially in modern Israel, they needed to find a common voice. And so, after thousands of years, Hebrew was revived, not just as a sacred tongue, but as a living, breathing language that could unify them once more. Despite their cultural differences, the Jewish people remained deeply connected by faith. Yet, even their religious traditions reflected their unique histories. The Sephardic Jews brought the poetic beauty of Spanish melodies into their prayers, their voices rising in deep, soulful tunes that carried across synagogues in Turkey, Greece, and Morocco. The Ashkenazi Jews developed a distinct rhythm, their prayers chanted with a yearning shaped by centuries of suffering and resilience in Eastern Europe. Their traditions carried the weight of survival, the echoes of a people who had found strength in the coldest winters of history. The Mizrahi Jews, whose roots stretched back to the days of Babylonian exile, wove the warmth of the Middle East into their rituals. Their prayers carried the cadence of ancient desert lands, infused with the sounds of Arabic and Persian influence. But at their core, all three groups remained united by the same Torah, the same faith, and the same unshakable connection to the land of their ancestors. If history could be told through flavors, Jewish cuisine would be a tale of adaptation and survival. The Sephardic Jews, influenced by Spanish, Turkish, and Arabic cultures, filled their tables with spiced meats, rich olive oils, and fragrant saffron rice. The Ashkenazi Jews, enduring harsh winters in Eastern Europe, relied on simple yet hearty foods, potato latkes, gefilte fish, and warm challah bread. The Mizrahi Jews, raised in the heat of the Middle East, brought the flavors of their lands: slow-cooked meats, roasted eggplant, and dishes infused with pomegranate and dates. Each bite told the story of where they had been. But no matter where they had come from, one thing remained true. Food was more than sustenance. It was tradition, memory, and identity. And so, even though these groups had been shaped by different histories, they had never truly been apart. Their languages, prayers, and meals were different, but their spirit was one. The Jewish people had endured exile, but exile had never divided them. And so, despite centuries of exile, despite being scattered across different continents, the Jewish people remained one. Their languages, customs, and traditions had adapted to the lands they lived in, yet their shared faith and history bound them together. But the darkest chapter of their story was yet to come. one that would nearly erase an entire generation of Ashkenazi Jews. The Ashkenazi Jews, who had built vibrant communities across Poland, Russia, Germany, and Eastern Europe, had already faced endless waves of pogroms, forced expulsions, and discrimination. But nothing could have prepared them for what was coming. In 1933, Adolf Hitler rose to power in Nazi Germany, bringing with him an ideology fueled by hatred and destruction. At first, Jewish businesses were boycotted. Then, their rights were stripped away. Soon, Jewish families were forced into ghettos, living in starvation, disease, and fear. But this was only the beginning. By 1941, the Nazis had launched the final solution, a systematic plan to eradicate the Jewish people. Trains packed with men, women, and children were sent to Auschwitz, Treblinka, and Dachau, names that would become synonymous with horror. Mothers clutched their children as they were led to gas chambers, not knowing it would be their last embrace. Fathers were torn from their families, forced into brutal labor, only to perish from exhaustion and starvation. 6 million Jews were murdered. Entire families were erased. Entire communities were wiped off the map. The Ashkenazi world, which had taken centuries to build, was reduced to ashes in just a few years. But once again, the Jewish people refused to vanish. While the Holocaust targeted European Jews, Sephardic and Mizrahi Jews in North Africa and the Middle East were facing their own battles. In Morocco, Algeria, and Tunisia, Nazi forces spread their influence, sending Jews to labor camps and seizing their homes. In Iraq, the Farhud of 1941 saw Jewish neighborhoods burned, families slaughtered in the streets, and in Yemen and Syria, centuries of anti-Semitism worsened, forcing thousands of Jews to flee in desperation. They were not sent to concentration camps, but their lives were still at risk. For them, the war was a different kind of nightmare, one of fear, exile, and uncertainty. After World War II, the Jewish survivors of the Holocaust had nowhere to go. Their homes were gone. Their families were gone. Europe had become a graveyard. And so, with nothing left to lose, they turned to the one place they had always dreamed of returning to: Israel. In 1948, the State of Israel was officially established, a historic moment that marked the return of the Jewish people to their ancient homeland. But the journey was far from easy. Hundreds of thousands of Holocaust survivors, Sephardic Jews, and Mizrahi Jews poured into the new nation. They had escaped genocide and persecution, but now they faced a new battle, building a country from nothing. At first, there was division. Ashkenazi Jews, who had suffered in Europe, dominated politics and government, while Mizrahi and Sephardic Jews, who had been in the Middle East for centuries, struggled to gain equal rights. Many Mizrahi Jews were placed in poor settlements, treated as second-class citizens, despite having lost everything, just like their Ashkenazi brothers and sisters. But as time passed, something remarkable happened. Despite differences, despite struggles, Israel became a home for all Jews. They built cities, farmlands, and industries. They rebuilt their culture, their language, their identity, not as separate groups, but as one people. The Holocaust had nearly destroyed them. Exile had nearly erased them. But once again, the Jewish people had done what they had always done. They survived. And this time, they had a home. And so, after centuries of exile, after the horrors of the Holocaust, the expulsion from Arab lands, and the struggles of early Israel, the Jewish people had finally returned home. But coming home didn't mean the struggle was over. It meant a new chapter had begun. For the first time in over 2,000 years, Jews from every corner of the world, Ashkenazi, Sephardic, and Mizrahi, were now living together. But though they shared a land, they did not always share an identity. Different languages, different customs, different experiences. Could they truly become one people again? When Israel was born in 1948, the early leaders were mostly Ashkenazi Jews, who had come from war-torn Europe. They had experienced pogroms, concentration camps, and centuries of discrimination in Christian lands. Their vision of Israel was shaped by their own history, one of European ideals, secularism, and Western influence. But then came the Mizrahi Jews, Jews from Iraq, Yemen, Morocco, Iran, and Egypt. Unlike Ashkenazi Jews, they had lived for centuries in Muslim lands, speaking Arabic, Persian, or Judeo-Berber, carrying the traditions of Babylon, Persia, and the Sahara. Many arrived in Israel with nothing but the clothes on their backs after being expelled from their home countries. They had survived riots, massacres, and forced exiles. Yet, in Israel, they found themselves facing a new kind of struggle: acceptance. For decades, Mizrahi Jews were treated as outsiders in their own homeland. Many were forced into poor development towns, given low-paying jobs, and excluded from politics and power. Their traditions, their music, their language, their religious customs were often dismissed as less civilized by the Ashkenazi elite. But over time, things began to change. Despite the early tensions, something beautiful was happening. Cultures were mixing. Mizrahi music, once confined to immigrant communities, began filling the streets of Tel Aviv and Jerusalem. The deep, emotional tunes of Yemenite and Moroccan Jews merged with modern Israeli pop, creating a new sound that the whole country embraced. Hebrew, once a language mostly spoken in religious study, became the national language, uniting Jews who had once spoken Yiddish, Ladino, or Judeo-Arabic. Sephardic Jewish food, spiced meats, fresh olives, and aromatic rice dishes found its place alongside traditional Ashkenazi dishes like challah, gefilte fish, and kugel. A new Israeli cuisine was born, blending flavors from every Jewish tradition. Even in religious life, barriers started to break. Sephardic rabbis, once sidelined, became leading voices in Jewish law. The strict European style of Judaism softened as Sephardic and Mizrahi traditions reclaimed their place in Jewish spiritual life. As Israel continued to grow, new discoveries confirmed something that had always been felt. Despite their differences, Ashkenazi, Sephardic, and Mizrahi Jews were deeply connected. DNA studies found that Jews, no matter where they had come from, shared a common ancestry. Whether their ancestors had lived in Poland, Spain, or Iraq, the genetic markers told the same story. They were all descendants of the ancient Israelites. So, after centuries of being scattered across the world, after facing persecution in different lands, after struggling to understand each other, the Jewish people were still one. And today, that unity is stronger than ever. And so, after centuries of exile, survival, and resilience, the Jewish people stand today, united not by land, not by language, but by something far deeper. They were scattered across the world. They became Ashkenazi, Sephardic, and Mizrahi, shaped by the cultures around them, yet never fully belonging. They endured expulsions, wars, massacres, and even near total destruction. They spoke different languages, ate different foods, sang different prayers. But through it all, they never lost their shared soul. Even when the world tried to erase them, they refused to disappear. Even when their homes were burned, their families taken, and their synagogues destroyed, they carried their history within them, not in stone, but in spirit. The story of the Jewish people is not just about suffering. It is about strength, adaptation, and the will to live. It is about people who refuse to let history define them as victims. Instead, they took their pain and turned it into wisdom, innovation, and creation. The Ashkenazi Jews, after centuries of persecution in Europe, rose to become some of the greatest thinkers, scientists, and leaders the world has ever known. The Sephardic Jews, expelled from Spain, rebuilt their communities in distant lands, bringing with them rich poetry, music, and scholarship. The Mizrahi Jews, torn from their homes in the Middle East, carried the warmth of ancient traditions, breathing life into the very soul of Israel. Each community suffered, and each community triumphed, and yet one question remains unanswered. Can a people divided by geography and history truly be united by faith and culture? The answer lies in Israel, where Ashkenazi, Sephardic, and Mizrahi Jews now live side by side, creating a new identity, one that is neither purely Eastern nor Western, but something uniquely Jewish. They are still debating, still arguing, still struggling, but this is what has kept them alive for thousands of years. They are still here. They are still one people. But history is not just about the past. It's about what happens next. The story of the Jewish people is still being written, and the deeper you go, the more you discover. If you found this journey through history fascinating, make sure to watch the full video to understand every detail. There is so much more hidden beneath the surface. And if you want to explore more historical mysteries, subscribe to the channel, hit the like button, and turn on notifications. Your support helps bring more untold stories to life. What do you think? Is unity truly possible after centuries of division? Let us know in the comments. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.